Good morning. I call to order the December 2025 meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for everyone joining us in the West Committee room. As a reminder, while today's meeting is not live streamed, the recording will be made available on the board's YouTube channel after today's meeting. The first item of business this morning is to discuss our 2025-26 committee work plan. Vice Chair Bergstrom and I worked with Executive Director Steves and Associate Secretary Langworthy to design the plan we have before us today. So Executive Director Steves, can you walk us through the work plan, please?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, this would be our version of a flexible work plan. And so we are trying to ensure that the committee has some flexibility to take up issues as needed during the year, but also touch on a few important items. I will say that the committee's workload, and part of the reason this is its first meeting of the year, is a little bit lighter because it has had some heavy lifts over the past 3 years where it has completely revised bylaws, done a committee restructure of the board, done a number of other things that are significant, important, and were time consuming. And so there's a little bit less work on the agenda this year than normal, but we'll spend some time starting today a conversation about the reservation delegation of authority policy in a very narrow sense about one issue in that policy. So there's time reserved to, should that conversation lead to some revisions. We'll take in some feedback about our active learning days that we've been piloting this year more extensively. We thought it might be helpful to touch on just some of the AI trends and best practices that other governing boards are engaged in. It's very early days in that sense, but we have actually been getting some information from our peers, both in terms of whether they're setting up policies, but also just in terms of their own board practices related to AI and some of the dangers associated with that. And then we know that there's an ongoing review of the university's compliance structure, and so we've reserved some time tentatively for this committee to take up any resulting policy changes that might grow out of that as well. So that's what we have on the slate for the year.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions or discussion from others? Just really appreciate the last couple years. I know Regents Johnson and Wheeler are well aware of the details we went through in the last couple years to bring many of our policies current. It was just a matter of inertia had allowed them to sit for so long, and so it was really great to dig in and bring those current. So are there any questions, discussion on the work plan? All right. Thank you very much. Our second item is to discuss board's appointment authority. Presenting this item is Associate Secretary Jason Langworthy and Committee on Policy Coordinator Maggie Marcassani. Before we turn to our presenters, though, Executive Director Steves, would you kick us off?
Absolutely. Madam Chair, members of the committee, the reservation delegation of authority policy is a cornerstone policy. There are many policies the board has, but there are some that are really important and then others that are just somewhat important. So this is one of the really important ones. It broadly defines, as you know, all authority at the university rests with the board, and then you delegate authority through the president across the university. And so this policy isn't the only place where delegations are articulated, but it is the primary place where those delegations are articulated. And so this is one of those, I often talk about the 4 fundamental questions that boards grapple with across time. And this is one of those questions, is who's responsible for different things. And that is the fundamental decisions around when you delegate authority, when you retain authority for yourself. And so today's discussion will focus on an element of this policy. And the reason why, and that the element we're going to be focusing on, is related to personnel appointments related to athletics. And why talk about that? Well, athletics has been an area that is dynamic and changing across time, and it only seems to be accelerating in its change. And even though this has been an area where the committee has previously grappled with and landed in different places, it's worth coming back to, and we've actually heard from members of the board that there's a desire to come back to this topic and talk about it again and see if maybe there is a little bit of an adjustment needed on the thermostat.
So Chair Verhalen, members of the committee, good morning. So let's talk about that evolution of appointment threshold in this area. And we'll give you a brief history of the, as it swings back and forth as boards have taken up this topic previously. So before 1990, right, as the board sort of started to move from more in the management to more of the governing board and the policy board, before 1990, generally all personnel matters were brought to the board for approval. In 1973, the board started to refine that, first taking any non-tenured academic staff and civil service staff below roughly $14,000, delegating that to the president. And then the big change was in September of 1990. And at that point, the board decided to delegate all personnel matters to the president, and you'll recall that the president can then certainly delegate from there within the administration, but reserved in sort of the model of the United States Senate or the Minnesota Senate, sort of the advise and consent for sort of high-level positions like chancellors, the provosts, vice presidents, those positions that have a significant impact administratively on the mission of the university are the sort of the key hires of the president. And so to maintain that oversight, they created this advise and consent where they wanted to confirm those recommendations from the president. On the athletic side, that included athletic directors, which is something that has continued through policy today. So they decided athletic directors, given the influence and impact that they have in directing those programs, should be one of those positions that the board ultimately looks at. There was at that time some regents who expressed concerns about excluding coaches, that they were interested in having coaches, but the ultimate policy just had athletic directors in addition to those top-level administrative positions. The board came back to it just 2 years later in September of 1992 and did a couple of things. First, they clarified that athletic directors was Division I athletic directors. So any campus across the system where there was Division I athletics, they moved that to Division I athletic directors. Then they decided that they did want to name specific head coaching positions. So in 1992, that was Division I head coaches in men's football, basketball, hockey for the Twin Cities, hockey for Duluth, and then women's volleyball, basketball, gymnastics, and softball on the Twin Cities campus. And that stayed into effect for a really long time to 1995. And so in 1995, the board, after having various coach contracts come, the board at that time felt like there were too many coach contracts. They were spending too much time on these coaching decisions. And in 1995, they decided to move back to delegating that authority to the president. There was concerns, though, from the regents at the time, just given even then at that point the high sort of profile nature of these positions, to create some sort of language to encourage the president to bring forward any initial appointments or special appointments that raise significant public impact, raise serious policy issues, or create substantial financial impact on the university. And so that sort of catch-all language, encouraging or allowing both the board to say, we think that there are some specific subsection of positions that we think we should hire at this point, and the direction of the president to bring forward anything, was that sort of compromise language that the board put in place in 1995. That was further refined in 2001, and that language remains today. And we'll show you that language here in a minute. Then we jump to February of 2018. So things remain pretty constant, but with the evolution of athletics that we were seeing even at that point, based on the high profile nature of those positions and the compensation, the regents at that point wanted to look again at appointment authority. And the board at that point went back and forth between naming specific positions as was done before, or setting a dollar threshold, which some of our peers do. And so they landed at, so they did a couple things. One, in 2018, they clarified that both the initial appointment and any significant amendments to board-approved employment agreements were subject to board approval. Then they added a threshold where agreements that have a total value of more than $1 million would require board approval. And so for purposes of that subdivision, it was defined as total value shall mean the potential amount due to the employee if the university terminated the employment agreement without cause. So on day two, if that person was terminated, how much would the university owe? It also applied to faculty members if their first year compensation was more than $1 million, or if the faculty member was terminated and we would have to pay the faculty member $1 million or more. Now, as this was implemented, because of sort of how you define total value and the amount due on termination and what you include in that or not, that caused some issues in terms of implementation. It was not the easiest to implement. So for some of you that were on the committee, when we revisited as a part of the broader view of the board's approval thresholds in March of 2024, you decided to eliminate that dollar threshold since it was more difficult to implement, and instead just name the specific positions. And so with that, Committee and Policy Coordinator Mark Kazani will take you through the current thresholds that were adopted in March of 2024.
Good morning, Chair Verhalen and members of the committee. As adopted in March 2024, your policy has reserved authority to the board for employment contracts in a couple of ways. And the first is by naming specific positions, and for athletics, that included maintaining the requirement for the Division I Director of Intercollegiate Athletics, as well as adding the Division I head coaching positions for football, men's and women's basketball, men's and women's hockey, and volleyball. As Associate Secretary Langworthy noted, the other provision that triggered board approval is if an employment agreement raised an unusual question of public policy or public interest or had a significant impact on the university's mission. And that language aligns with other language within the policy, which creates flexibility for the president to bring forward items that are delegated if they wish to do so. I will also note, going back to the positions, that the head coaching positions that were added are included here are positions that have previously triggered that dollar threshold. We also thought that it would be helpful to provide the committee with a comparison of public institutions across the Big Ten. And we found that our peers that require approval of coaching contracts typically fall into one of two broad categories. The first is those that set a threshold by position, and there were 4 of those, with 3 of them naming specific head coaching positions and the 4th requiring all positions. 5 set a dollar threshold, either based on the president's salary, a dollar amount set annually, or by campus within a system. And then of those that don't require board approval, of which there are 6, we did want to flag the one that requires after the fact reporting if the agreement is outside of established parameters. And now I will turn the presentation back over to Associate Secretary Langworthy to talk you through some potential adjustments.
So as Executive Director Steve said, we've heard from, members of the board some questions around, how do we ensure that the oversight here by the board is at the right level and that it doesn't feel too after the fact, just given the evolution of coaching contracts. I think you could say that anytime the board looks at something, it helps to change sort of behavior, and it provides specific sort of guidance. But how that's applied and when that's applied, I think depends on where you want to have the board engaged in the process. And so here, these potential adjustments, we came up with 4. You can mix and match. You can sort of look across, but these are based on what we found from Big Ten peers, and also what, again, that sort of as that pendulum has swung back and forth. So certainly you could create some pre-approval parameters where, you define specific terms that if the agreement stays within those terms, the president can, approve those contracts or delegate the approval of those contracts. Those parameters could be set annually, like the two Big Ten examples. I believe that's Indiana and UCLA, who look each year at what the compensation sort of threshold is and set that. The board sets that. Or you could look at a more static one, the one that sort of is by campus, that's Wisconsin, and I believe it's 3 million for Madison, and then there's a separate threshold for the other campuses. So you could certainly look at that. You could also consider including some after-the-fact reporting so that you see what that agreement looks like and have that transparency into that if you grant that pre-approval. You could move back to a threshold, and certainly we could define that threshold in whatever way you think would be the right threshold to do in terms of a specific compensation number. And then above that compensation number, the agreement comes for board approval. Again, we would just want to be careful in how you specify that threshold and that dollar threshold. We could remove the threshold. You could amend the policy just to go back to delegating that back to the president if you feel that board oversight in this area is not as helpful given the current landscape. You could continue to retain the catch-all language to encourage the president to bring something forward. You could also set, again, some specific parameters or provisions to guide the president in when, they should bring those items back. And you could keep with the current list of head coaches. You could adopt some guidance on expectations for employment agreement provisions. So where would you want them to land in the market? What are some buyout provisions? Could that be by sport? Is there a process in which you ensure that the president and our executive vice president for finance and operations have an opportunity to be a part of those contract agreements or at least see what is being negotiated before it gets too far down the road where the contract is pretty close to final? So there's again, various ways that you can adjust. You can also just leave the policy as is, of course, but just based on the previous conversation and some of the comments made by Regents, we wanted to at least tee up some potential options for you. And so with that, Chair Verhalen, members of the committee, we're happy to respond to any questions and certainly hear your discussion and conversation to inform, if you do feel like you want to move towards some potential changes to the policy or not.
Thank you. All three of you, really appreciate it. I guess some initial thoughts while others gather theirs. It is very cumbersome in a highly negotiated, high-profile area to try and think about what these pre-approvals could look like. There are so many different ways these compensation packages can be structured, as well as just the speed at which some of these need to move. Even since the time I joined this board, college athletics has changed drastically. And that's, not even to include those employees who, are, quote, highly compensated, which was why we discussed this before back in 2024, because we were running into some of those items. And so where I sit now, it feels awkward, I think, to a lot of people outside of our world to see a contract come before us after it's been negotiated and signed. But part of that is actually how business is done in other enterprises, in other corporations. There is a board that determines the CEO's salary and makes those very specific determinations on compensation, et cetera. And then there is typically a compensation committee that is there for the CEO to consult if they're going, if there are other individuals who are in that bucket with the CEO, and to discuss, what does the C-suite get paid, for example. We have a different model in higher education. And I see benefits and burdens with each of these. And for me, the question is, which ones fulfill our requirement of oversight, but appropriately recognize and appreciate the delegation we have given to those that we've hired in these positions. It's interesting to me that we have said we're going to approve our athletic director here at the Twin Cities and their salary, and then these other specific positions, mostly at the Twin Cities campus, but then the other campuses get to do what they want, need to, et cetera, to hire their talent for their positions that they have open, whether it's sports or otherwise. So those are just some of the thoughts rolling around in my brain. I did have one clarifying question. If we go back to the Big Ten comparison slide, by position, it says 4 with 3 naming specific head coach positions. What does the 4th one do?
Chair Verhalen, the fourth school, which I believe is Ohio State University,
B.
The Ohio State University, yes, excuse me, requires it of all athletics positions.
Okay. All head coaching positions or all positions?
I believe it's all positions. Our research looked at athletics positions. I believe it's all athletics positions.
Okay.
That's what we found.
Yeah, because I know we at the board level have had discussions about, okay, head coach, but head coach is coming with these assistants, or the coach is bringing this assistant group in, where do the thresholds fall, et cetera. So I am done rambling. Executive Director Steves and then Regent Johnson.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, I would just offer that there is something that's changed, that's different as these policies have been in place. And that is that unlike hiring a provost, where the president hires a provost, announces that they're planning to hire this person as the provost, they aren't starting for 2 or 3 or how many ever months. In that interim time, the board takes up consideration of the appointment and the contract. It makes the approval of the individual, and then subsequent to that, they start. The challenge is, and I think back in the day, that's how it worked in athletics too. It's just that today, with the advent of the transfer portal, the moment a coach is announced, they are effectively an employee because they are immediately recruiting and they are trying to build their team. And that's the dynamic that's different today. There is no window of time after announcement until they then begin to act as if they are an employee of the university and are engaged and representing us and our brand. That's why we're seeing at least some saying, maybe what you need to do is give some parameters or set some band within which the president has ability to operate, because effectively they're an employee immediately. Instead of trying to wedge it into the model for other positions. And so it's a difficult, thorny issue, but that's the thing that's changed.
Yeah, and it comes into play even when renegotiating contracts with existing, because in the time that those individual, we make the announcement, X head coach has re-signed an agreement, it will be coming to the board in a special meeting, et cetera. That individual now has basically said, I'm not looking for another job. And so recruiters are moving on to the next one, even though it is such a time sensitive, it's still pending. Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. There is this awkward period between it gets announced on the sports page and the 6 o'clock news, and suddenly it's like, okay, and it seems like the sort of this pro forma rubber stamp by the board. And anyway, there is this awkward period. But just for those of the new folks who, we do get a whole bunch of information in advance when we're hiring these folks. it, gets on the docket of the meeting. Everybody knows that we could vote it down. And so, potentially, as Brian was saying, conceivably, there could be a less awkward way of doing it. But the way it's done right now is we're given a ton of information. We're told exactly, where this lands with regard to other Big Ten coaches and athletic directors, how the salaries frequently, usually in the bottom 3 or 4 in the Big Ten. And so, I mean, we are given a lot of information, certainly before the meeting. We could vote it down if we wanted to. But yeah, there is this very awkward thing that occurs when it gets announced before our vote. And if there's a remedy to that, that might be worth listening to.
Yeah, and I think you said something that's really important. To people outside of this board, our approvals may look like they're perfunctory, like they're just ministerial. Once it comes to us, we're just signing off on it. I think you said rubber stamp. And that's certainly not been my experience. There's a lot of dialogue about the agreements we see. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of that's provided, but a lot of it is private personnel data under the Data Practices Act. And so it's not necessarily all there from day one in the public realm, but it is part of our duty as Regents to ask those questions and dig into those issues. Other thoughts?
Yeah,
Regent Wheeler?
I think I was one of the people who raised this last time because because of the changes that have occurred, this has to happen in an incredibly timely fashion, so, and last time, I think it was with the basketball coach who was named, who looks to be an excellent hire. That said, the press conference occurred. I was at an athletic event. He stood up and was introduced to everybody there, and somebody elbowed me and said, "So when is the Board of Regents approved?" Like 2 weeks from now, So it seems like there has to be a way to move with greater alacrity in this, and for me, that's either like the board or a subset of the board has to act quickly, on the information, because sometimes we don't get even the packet of information, right before the press conference occurs. So I agree, it's detailed, and I agree with everything Regent Johnson said. It's detailed, but it's sometimes after the fact, and we have to allow for movement. So I'd say either we have to find a mechanism by which we could approve this quickly. There has to be some guardrails saying, something like of market, 60% of market or above has to come through, or there has to be, just allow the president to do it without any consultation of the board. But I just worry about the speed of this happening, and us being able to do our fiduciary duty correctly, given that is after the fact.
Yeah.
So.
President Cunningham?
Yeah, I'll just highlight a little bit of what Brian was saying is, this is different than our other personnel entirely, right? A provost hire has a national search and, faculty and community input and lots of other things like that. Athletics in the semi-professionalization of the athletic world that we currently live in is on a different plan and a different timeline in a lot of different ways. And it is happening very quickly. And there's opportunity to certainly talk to, board leadership in a short amount of time. It is likely difficult to pull together a full board meeting within the short amount of window for which the athletics director goes from 2 or 3 names for which he has been vetting with me to what that final one is. And then I don't understand exactly why, I'll admit, but then the press conference is basically immediately, probably because they're entertaining multiple offers and it's this kind of competitive market. So just to kind of give that background a little bit. I didn't bring this to the board, and I'm happy to do whatever the board would like on it. The percentage of market for compensation, this is something we're using very regularly, and I think we'd want to have some latitude on it, but certainly anything that was over the 75th percentile or something, right? But if it's, otherwise well within the range, and certainly for athletics, we are not close to that typically. But something like that would be within the realm of what we do sort of, in other places as well. And because the dollar amounts unfortunately are changing so fast that putting a dollar amount on it would be out of date immediately.
Well, and they're so disparate. I mean, they are so broad. And, you know, just to your point, President Cunningham, you're in a position where these are all employees. They all eventually report up to you. But you, the athletic director, some of these coaching positions are earning more than those who are hiring them and those who are negotiating their roles. The bandwidth idea is interesting to me, where we say, you know, so long as it doesn't exceed X% of market, and then we get the data on market, we have the opportunity to audit it, we have the opportunity to evaluate it, we have the opportunity to continue to keep it in mind, and, you know, maybe it becomes, then if we're doing that, maybe it becomes more of a, we look at it when we hire someone right now in these positions, maybe it becomes more part of, okay, here's how the market's changing as we go along. You know, it's part of the informational items in finance and operations or something like that. If here's where these positions are moving. I also want, and I appreciate you saying this, I want to be really clear. This was not brought to the board by administration. No one in administration said, dear board, please change this. This was a board initiated discussion due to what we were seeing in these positions, in our discussions, and what we're seeing in the market, for lack of a better term. And so I appreciate you saying that, but I want to be very clear about that.
And one follow-up point, and for this, you know, in other areas, there's maybe more discussion about exactly what our peer set is or things like that. This is super clear. The conference for which we are competing in is the peer set, and the benchmarks are readily available of whether we are, you know, out of what is now 18 instead of 10, you know, where we are in that market.
The market survey is very clear.
Very clear.
Yeah. Well, and if we set a threshold, we could also have the discussion about, okay, then does it apply to all the campuses as well?
Yeah.
Right now, we are very targeted to specific positions on really the Twin Cities and Duluth campuses, but that shouldn't diminish the importance of justification at the other campuses as well, whether it's D3 or otherwise. Regent Bergstrom.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. One question and then just kind of a comment about how we could maybe mix and match on this. I like exploring the idea of what's the band for different positions. And the band, it could be in hockey, we could be, 90 percentile, right? Like, or, whereas in football, we're not 90th, right?
We could
So
get
for
those
different positions, we may have different benchmarks. So I like having that explored. And then I'm wondering, and I'm guessing not, but are there any of our peers where thinking of kind of a Supreme Court comparison where there's a justice rides circuit and kind of has initial chance to look at something that's urgent, do any of our peers have a subset of their board, whether it be 3 or 4 who are in a given year, that group that is consulted and has the delegation of the board to be that immediate consultation in that 48-hour window where these things have to move quickly, to allow for some, not cover for the athletic director and president, but as a sounding board.
Chair Verhalen, Regent Bergstrom, we could look more at committee structures within various Big Ten boards. I'm not familiar with something like that, but I will say, depending on the state, different boards have different open meeting laws and have the ability to meet in closed session or executive committees where some of those conversations can happen in a very different format than what we have here in Minnesota. So my suspicion would be, especially in Michigan with the University of Michigan and Michigan State, those conversations are likely happening in an executive session where they have the ability to do that. But we could certainly check to see if there's anything more specific in the way that you're describing. I'm not familiar with anything like that, but we could take a look.
And really quickly, just our board policy on special or emergency sessions is if we were to try and incorporate something like that. I mean, coordinating 12 schedules has its own thing, but what are our policies now?
So in terms of, Chair Verhalen, in terms of calling, right, a special or emergency meeting, the board chair can call that, or 5 regents at the request of 5 regents. And, then it's a matter of the notice period. So for a special meeting, it's at least 3 days notice. For an emergency meeting, it is, we do our best. The other item I'll note that has not been used very often as of late is in Board of Regents policy, board operations and agenda guidelines, there is what's called emergency approval. And that process has evolved over time. The current process is first we try to see if there's a special emergency meeting and if there's enough regents to do that. If a quorum is not available, then the board chair is granted authority to sign off on something using the authority of the board. It used to be called urgent approval, and that threshold used to be much different in terms of the reporting and sort of the quorum requirements. So that is another tool if something really needed to be done and we couldn't assemble the board.
President Cunningham.
Yeah, 2 things. One, to add on, yes, we are very unusual here in Minnesota in that we cannot have most places, including many of the former institutions and other folks that I know, this would be a special emergency meeting that's called and would be done. So that's not available to us. But I suspect even with some of these, the way these are actually being approved are not in open session. I mean, the final vote may be a month later, but the pre-approval and work is done in a private session. But I just want people to be aware also when this has happened with me and certainly with my predecessor, we are discussing with board leadership. So, there is a board leadership, notice just to defer anybody from the idea that I'm willy-nilly throwing around incredibly large coach salaries without any discussion with the board. So that the board leadership is certainly brought into the loop.
Yeah. Right. Anything before we conclude this discussion and send our staff off with a list of ideas to see what we can come up with? Regent Johnson.
I guess I'm wondering, and maybe this is for Jason or Brian, if there's a preliminary discussion as to, parameters and potential. I mean, I remember when we were electing an interim president, we had the newspaper guessed who they were really quickly, but we had sort of a blind discussion about so many people we were looking at, and I'm just wondering if a process, if you guys have thought about a process wherein, we're looking at a new coach for whatever sport, and here's the the Big Ten parameters. Here's the highest, here's the lowest. Where the sweet spot where we want to be. We're looking at somebody who would require to be in this spot. Anyway, I'm just curious if you've thought about how that could work if we did any kind of preliminary discussion before an official offer were made.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, please go ahead, because I have a
You
question.
mean of the specific people or of the range? Because if it's of the people, I think what my athletic director would want me to say here is, and the reason I think this is done other places, in closed session is, it's a competitive market and you can't have anything that would be letting people know what you're offering here and there, around. So, even though it's anything that's specific to the individuals being blinded, I think would not be implementable. But if it was a range of, we want you to hire out of the Big 18, anything more than the 10th salary spot or something needs to come, that would be implementable. But saying we have 3 candidates and we're going to talk about them blindly, the time frame wouldn't work and the way the competitive market works, I don't think would be implementable for the athletic director.
And I would think, I'm speaking more for myself, and others may have other thoughts, but, we aren't specialists in these fields. Like I can look at someone's win-lose record and do some Googling and see what news is out there for them, but I certainly don't know the ins and outs of their practice to know whether they'd be what I want in a role versus what the team needs in a role.
Yeah.
I think you're getting at the question there of sort of what is the governance? And for me, this is 2 levels down below me as well now, right? So we are relying heavily on the expertise of the people that are supervising these teams and positioned to know what the appropriate person is. And then when I view this as in my delegated role in general is, have we done the proper background checks, reputation to the university, salary within range, but in terms of talent or other kinds of things, like that is well out of what would be even my realm for one of these coaching positions.
And Chair Verhalen, I'll just add, to what the president said, that's also what we've heard previously, where we've had coaching contracts come in and there's been a desire not to wait for the next regular meeting, but to take a special meeting, given the competitive nature and given the offers. So I think Regent Johnson, it would be very difficult to set up a structure like we did with the interim. On the other side, though, proactively setting those market ranges,
Right.
and we see that with peers, where, right, 2 are setting those thresholds annually. So you could have just an annual item, maybe it's at the June meeting of finance and operations to prepare for the next academic year, where you reevaluate those market ranges and the board says, yep, these are the ranges for this year. Anything, above, needs to come for approval. Anything below, delegated to the president, and with, you could add in that after the fact review that Maryland does there.
So the after the fact review is Maryland.
Yes.
And it says that it requires board committee review. Is that a subset of the board then that reviews
Yes,
it?
they do have a compensation review committee.
And they
I
just,
believe.
they review it. They do not review and approve it?
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right,
We do need to.
we got to wrap here quickly, so Regent Bergstrom.
Real quick, we could also look at within that. It take a little bit more time on our end, but after each hiring season, reviewing that sport, right? Because that's when the market's going to change. So, for football, the market will change in January. So we could look at it in the spring, and then every other sports after the season, because that's when thresholds change.
Sorry, I laughed just thinking about the numbers that have been thrown around with some of
Oh,
the
that's bonkers.
East Coast and Southern states in just the last 2 weeks. All right, Executive Director Steves, Associate Secretary Langworthy, Ms. Nakasani, do you all have what you need to try and put together some framework ideas for us going forward that we may revisit in February? Wonderful. So that brings us to information items. Executive Director Steves, anything to highlight?
Madam Chair, just a couple of information items on policies that have been completed for comprehensive review, and no changes were recommended, and so they will go back into the policy review cycle.
Great. Any questions or comments? All right. There being no additional business before the committee, we stand adjourned, and we are supposed to be starting the board meeting at 9, which according to my clock is in 1 minute, but according to that one is in 4 minutes. So
Let's go off that clock then.